Today we're going to be replacing this end table in my house with a mid-century modern inspired table. I began this build by selecting lumber for the project. It doesn't need a ton of it and I wanted to use offcuts, so I chose some curly maple and black walnut that I had on hand. After cutting the maple to length, I oriented the boards how I'd like the final top to look. While finding a good look, I also paid close attention to the grain. Once I had something that was pleasing to my eye, I drew a carpenter's triangle on it to remember the orientation and began cleaning up the edges on the table saw. Notice the gaps between the boards before I ran them through the table saw. This would make for a really poor glue joint. After having the edges trimmed, it's a bit better, but still not good enough for me. So I used my tapering jig on the table saw to joint one edge, and then ripped the opposite edge parallel. This time the seams were much better, but I still had enough variation that I didn't like, so I decided to go a little bit further. So to get the seams perfect, I folded each pair of boards like a book, then with a really light setting on my hand plane, flattened the adjacent edges. Folding it like a book helps ensure that the edges fit perfectly together, even if the edges get a little out of square from the face. The result is an incredibly tight seam that will almost disappear when glued up. Speaking of glued up, I laminated the top and set it aside to dry. I was careful to keep it as flat as possible at this point since I don't have an easy way to flatten it later. With the top drying, I trued up a piece of 8/4 walnut for the legs. It had already been surfaced on 3 sides, but the edges were out of square, so I jointed it before ripping the legs into 1.5 inch by 1 inch leg blanks. I wanted the legs to have a subtle taper, so I marked a shoulder line first, then a taper on one of the leg blanks. I used my tapering jig again, this time orienting the cut line on the marks I'd made to create a taper. To make 4 identical tapers, I added a stop with blue tape and CA glue, which in combination with a fence helped me register the leg blanks in the same place for each cut. With the tapers cut, now is the dirty work of ripping 3 16th inch wide strips from the legs. This was a very messy part of the process, and I'd recommend wearing breathing protection for this task. With all of the leg strips cut, I cut a 3-degree angle on each end, which would allow the legs to cant out from the top at that same angle. Turning back to the top. After unclamping, I used a straight edge and my circular saw to cut off the uneven end on one side, then ran it through the table saw to get a final dimension of 16 by 16 inches. In this design, I wanted the legs to come from the corners. I marked 1.25 inches from each end, and connected them with a line. And at the table saw, I cut each corner of the top. Next, I needed to cut kerfs into the top to attach the legs. I thought this would be easiest on the table saw with a crosscut sled, but I had to build a jig. This is a simple jig that will hold the top upright as I cut the kerfs. After I put it together, I used a jigsaw to cut a sight window so I could line up the layout marks with the kerf on the sled. Then it was just a matter of cutting the 3 kerfs in each corner. Before assembly, I decided to do some pre-finishing, starting with sanding the bottom of the tabletop. routing a chamfer on the bottom edge, fitting each leg strip into a specific kerf using a block plane and a sander, then sanding and finishing the inside faces of the leg strips. I used 1 coat of shellac, then sanded with 400 grit and applied 2 coats of armor seal. At this point, I left the outside faces finish free. They've been sanded to 120 grit so far, but after assembly I'll sand to 220. Assembly was fairly easy, just applying glue to the strips and installing them to their specific kerfs. I could let it dry overnight, and an end table was finally coming together. The next morning I glued the leg strips together at the bottom. Individually, each leg strip is fairly weak, but by gluing them together at the bottom, it becomes much more rigid. And let's stop right here because I've made a massive mistake, and I want you to learn from my mistake. You see, I put blue tape where the end of the lamination was going to be. It is incredibly hard to dig blue tape out of those crevices, and so I spent a lot more time than I'd like to admit trying to fish tape out from each of those corners. So if I did this again, before I actually glue it up, I would remove that tape and let the squeeze out get into those tiny corners. Finally, with everything glued together, I can prep for a finish. Sanding through 80, 120, and 220 grits on the top, 220 on the legs, and a final wipe down with a tack cloth. I applied 1 coat of shellac and sanded with 400 grit. Then I applied 3 coats of Armor Seal semi-gloss, sanding with 400 and 600 grit between each coat. And after it had cured for a day, I buffed it with a little walrus oil wax and 4/0 steel wool. Thanks so much for sticking around. I really enjoyed this build and I hope you enjoyed it as well. And if you did enjoy this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks again and see you next time on the Bike City Woodworks channel.